guys! Welcome to Study Hall, where we learn from our past for a better future. Today, for episode 1, we will be talking about the LA riots of 1992. So, let's get started! The LA riots, also known as the Rodney King riots, were a series of riots that occurred in LA in April and May of 1992. But in order to understand these riots, we need to move back a little bit further. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, also known as the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. This act removed the national origins formula and also the discrimination against any non-white immigrants. Quick review, the national origins formula was an American system that was in place from the 1920s to 1965. It aimed to reduce unskilled immigrants primarily from Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe, and to essentially prevent immigration from changing the predominantly Protestant white population in the United States at this time. So it was with this act in 1965 and the removal of the national origins formula that made it so that Asians, my family included, started immigrating to the States en masse. By the 1980s, all these new neighborhoods started popping up, one of which was LA's Koreatown. Many Korean immigrants were, and still are today, shop owners, and they started opening up shops in areas like South LA where the rent was more affordable. In case you're unaware, South LA has been a part of the city that is historically black, and now Korean Americans are coming in and buying up all the businesses, so that by the early 90s, nearly 70% of all businesses in South LA were Korean owned. Now, because of these quickly changing demographics, there was a lot of tension between the Korean community and the black community. For starters, the black community saw the Koreans as being rude and unwelcoming, whereas they said it was a language barrier. There was also a lot of fear spread throughout the Korean newspaper about gang violence, murders, robberies. This really caused the Korean community to be extremely distrustful of the black community, on top of their extreme distrust of other races because of Korea's history of being oppressed and occupied by other countries. Also, it is worth mentioning that Korean immigrants mostly came here in the 70s or the late 60s, which was after the Civil Rights Movement. So they had no idea about the systemic injustice that worked against black people. So now that we've set the stage a little bit, back to the LA riots. On March 3rd of 1991, a 25-year-old black man named Rodney King was violently beaten over 50 times with batons by police, and it was all captured on camera by a bystander who lived nearby. Police brutality against the African American community in South Central was happening every day, but because this particular encounter was captured on camera, people saw this, they became outraged, and they took to the streets in peaceful protest. A few weeks later, on March 15th, a 15-year-old black teenager named Latasha Harlins walked into a corner store. The owner, a Korean woman named Soon Ja-do, accused her of stealing. They got into a physical altercation that ended with Soon Ja-do shooting and killing Latasha Harlins. Now, Soon Ja-do was convicted by a jury for voluntary manslaughter, but the judge let her off with a $500 fine, probation, community service, and no jail time. And while all of this is happening, Koreans are taking to the streets in protest. So the black community sees them as no worse than the racist cops. This just adds to the increasing tension. Now fast forward to April 29th, 1992, when a trial jury acquitted the 4 officers for use of excessive force in arresting and beating Rodney King. This led to 6 days of unrest and looting and violence. Now these riots were sparked by the anger over the injustice for Rodney King, but they were fueled by the growing tension between the Korean community and the black community. For the Korean shop owners, these 6 days of looting were devastating. Roads between Koreatown and surrounding wealthier neighborhoods were cut off, and emergency responders were unable or unwilling to respond to their calls. So because the police wouldn't come to defend the store owners, the Koreans decided to take up arms and defend them themselves. By the end of these 6 days, more than 2,000 Korean-owned businesses and 1,000 non-Korean-owned businesses were destroyed. 3,600 fires were set, 63 people lost their lives, and 2,000 people were injured. At the end of the day, the estimated damage was worth $1 billion. On May 2nd, a peaceful rally of 30,000 people took to the streets of K-Town. These were people of all colors and all races, and they were calling for peace and denouncing police brutality. So why is this significant for us to go over today? It's important for us to recognize where we have done wrong in our past and to seek to do better. Speaking as a member of one of the two groups in this story, Asians have two choices. We can choose to be victimized and be pitted against other groups like us, or we can choose to learn from our mistakes and unite over what we have in common. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 1 of Study Hall. We'll be back soon with more episodes to learn from our past for a better future. Thanks for tuning in. See you then. Bye!